Hey, ladies and gentlemen, today you are going to create a watercolor practice sheet. What this practice sheet is going to do, it is going to provide you a chance to play around with the medium. It's going to teach you some different techniques for the medium that might aid you when you go to actually paint your actual project. So this is the next project that we are preparing for. You guys should have read an article this week about Grant Wood and about American Gothic. And this actually is not the American Gothic, clearly. But the idea was that he created two figures. The two figures were standing in front of an architectural piece, and one of the figures was actually holding something. So this is going to be your overall design idea. And on this piece, I used a wet-on-wet technique. I used a wet-on-dry technique. I used a Sgraffito technique in the hair. I used a wet-on-dry technique here. I tried some different things where I also added just regular coloring pencil in different places. So these are just some different things, and depending upon what you ultimately end up doing, hopefully you'll have some fun with this and you'll be able to play with it, and you will be able to manipulate the medium in ways that will work for what you want to do with it. Watercolor comes in a lot of different varieties, so I pulled these out just in case this is what you have, rather than just to show you. So some of you might actually have tubes of watercolor, and this is, it comes all sealed up like that. The way you break the seal, there's a little point inside of the lid, and you just smush it down on there, and that breaks it open. I'm actually going to pull one of the blues out, and I'm going to use the blue because blue shows up really nicely on the screen so that you can see it. And if you have the tube watercolors, so I've just knocked a little hole in it, you will need to get some sort of palette that'll hold them separately. You can use a plate, like a plastic plate would be fine, as long as it's big. But what you do is you're just going to squeeze just a tiny bit of paint. You don't need a lot at all. So that was just the teeniest bit that I put in there. I'm going to go ahead and actually put some red in there too. On your practice, you can use whatever colors you want. It is entirely up to you. I'm picking colors that I know are going to show up better just for the purposes of demonstration. So I have a little bit of red, I have a little bit of yellow. I wanted to show you these. This right here is an artist's grade. These are called semi-moist watercolors. When I open them up, they look a little bit shiny, and if I touch them, they're mostly dry. They're just like a teeny bit sticky, but it doesn't like bring it up onto my hand. Watercolors come in lots and lots of colors, or they can come in lots and lots of watercolors. So if you think about your own, coloring pencils, you can buy the 12-pack, or you can buy, the 84-pack, or whatever the case is. So I'm going to go ahead and close up my Richesons. This is one series. These are opaque, dry watercolors. Most watercolors are semi-translucent. You might actually have watercolor pencils. And so I will go ahead and pull one of these out in a few minutes, so I can show you how those work. But the ones that I'm going to use today are my Crayola ones, and then I'm going to demonstrate a little bit with those. Some of you might have these praying ones. These are really nice. They come with a paintbrush. Let's set those aside. These I bought for Kroger at Kroger's. They were on sale when I got them, and Crayola has upped its game with its watercolors in recent years, and I rather like them. Okay, so we are going to create a demonstration page. Those of you that were in my class on Thursday and Friday, I sent you home with paper. This is the paper you want to use. Those of you that are at home, virtual students, I think I asked you to make sure that you brought some extra paper that you can use. This is a little bit heavier than some of the sketchbook paper. If all you have is sketchbook paper and it's real thin and lightweight, just be careful about how heavily and ham-fisted you might use the paper. Those of you that are coming to me Monday and Tuesday, I will be giving you this paper on Monday, and you will be working on this in class. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to fold my paper in half. I'm going to unfold it. I'm going to fold it in half this way, fold it back, and fold it back. This is going to give me 8 equal little sections. So we're going to fold it in half. Make sure your edges are lined up. If you want to fold nicely, I use this hand to go ahead and press down to make sure that those are nice and lined up. And then I'm going to use my thumb and make a nice crispy edge. I'm going to open this guy up, and I'm going to fold it this way. Make sure that those are all nice and lined up on this side, like so. Holding that down, I'm going to come over here, give that a nice crispy edge. Take these middles, I'll fold it up. I'm going to take this, flip this over, and I'm going to fold this up on this side. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 separate little rectangles. And I am going to write small along the top, wet on wet. I'm going to write wet on dry. Wet on wet, wet on dry. I'm going to put on this one, Watercolor Resist. On this one, I'm going to write salt. Down here, I'm going to write plastic wrap. On this one, I'm going to put Speckles. On this one, I'm going to write scratch. And this one, I'm going to write plastic print. Down here with plastic wrap on the other side, I'm going to write tissue. Okay, so these are the different things that we're going to do. Let's go ahead and get started. I did write this with a Sharpie marker. If you write this with a pen, the pen might bleed. A Sharpie marker probably won't bleed. You are welcome to write actually using a pencil. My original one, I wrote on here with pencil. So whatever works for you. The trick with watercolor is patience. When I was in high school, I really struggled with watercolor. I was sure it was going to be something that I was never going to actually learn ever because I was not a patient person. It's still questionable if I'm a patient person, but I've learned patience at least with watercolor. And so what I mean by patience is that you are going to have to give it time to dry. And you are not going to be able to rush it. If you try to rush this process, you're going to end up with something that you are not as happy with as you would want to be. So here's my plastic wrap, here's my plastic print, here is my tissue. So as you guys have been listening to me talk, I've been adding some stuff around here. And so literally, you are going to need salt, so just regular salt. You are going to need a little bit of plastic wrap. This actually is just a plastic bag. You can totally use a Kroger bag. This right here is a tissue. If you have toilet paper and you don't have tissues, you can totally use toilet paper. With the scratch, anything that will scratch the paper up. So I have a sewing needle here. You can use a thumbtack. You can use a nail. We're going to scratch lightly on the surface of the paper. We are not going to dig and scratch at it. So you're going to need a little bit of plastic, something to scratch. You're going to need tissue, the resist. You're going to need either your white coloring pencil or you're going to need a white crayon. You're going to need your cup of water. There's my cup of water. You're going to need paint brushes. And you're going to need your paint. Paint brushes. Let's talk about these really quick. Where's my huge stack of them? Some of you might have gotten paint brushes that look like this. I am going to actually use one of these smaller flat brushes. Yeah. A lot of times when you receive a paintbrush, what they do is they take it and they dip it in a little bit of sugar water. And the sugar water makes a nice point on the brush. You can always dip your brushes at home after you wash them really well in a little bit of sugar water, and then you use your fingers to kind of go back and flatten out the bristles. You want to make sure that the edges along here and around the barrel are nice and clean. Flat brushes are great for watercolor washes. Flat brushes are great for details that require flat edges. So I use a flat brush when I am painting lines. So like I will use a flat brush for things like this. And I try to actually get a flat brush that actually matches what I'm trying to paint. I use round brushes. A very small round brush that has been dipped in water should give you a pretty nice point. It's not going to be any smaller than what you see here. So if you look at the tip of my Sharpie, that's quite a bit smaller. So you're not going to be able to make a line like your Sharpie with a paintbrush that's that size. However, if you have a smaller paintbrush, you could get smaller details. But my round brush, I would do his hair with a round brush. I would do probably his skin tone with a round brush. I would use a round brush for anything that's soft on my paper. For his bow tie, seeing no problem kind of hitting it in there with my flat brush. But think about the areas you're painting and pick the appropriate tool for it. That's what you need to know about paintbrushes. So I have one round brush that's small, and then I have my big brush. And what I want to do is I want to pick up water, and I'm going to decide which colors I'm going to use. And I know purple is going to show up pretty well. So I'm going to dump a little bit of water in my purple. I'm going to wash that off a little bit. I'm going to dump some in my blue. What I really like about Crayola watercolors is that I think the blue is exceptionally pretty. It's not a UK blue, it is more of a cerulean blue. So if you're thinking, like, think Caribbean water and less UK, but it's all good. Okay, so wet on wet. When you do a wet on wet technique, you first of all want to make sure your paintbrush is really clean. You want to make sure your water is really clean. My water's starting to look a little bit blue, but I'm okay with that because I'm actually going to do a bit of a fade here. So I'm actually painting water on my paper. This is also why you want to use a heavier paper. If you have a sketchbook with multimedia paper in it, that's totally fine.
And we are going to keep this paper small. If I was watercoloring a big paper and I was making it all wet, I would actually tape my paper down to a board first. And then I would paint. And then that keeps the paper from warping too crazy. And so I painted water on this. And then I'm just going to drop my paint right in that. And what's really great about this technique is fantastic for sky. This technique is good for a base for skin tone. This technique is good for anything that needs to be blendy. So in a minute here, I'm going to take the purple, and I'm going to run the purple right up into this. And it mixed up some blue there. And I'm going to turn off the light here. I think that, well, I guess my lights in general are going to shine on here a little bit. I'm sorry about that. But I'm going to lift this up, and I'm going to allow the water to move a little bit. Now, something you need to know about watercolor. It stopped right there. And it stopped right there because that is where the water itself stopped. So I painted water up to that point right there. Now, if I kept letting this heavy bead of water go further, it would eventually push its borders. But in the meantime, water, for the most part, follows the path of least resistance. If you guys are into chemistry and physics, you have heard that before. So watercolor will go where the area is wet. When I paint details, when I painted the faces of my kids, what I did is I laid down the base color of their skin. And after I laid down the base color of their skin, I let it dry. It had to dry completely. And then after it was dry, I took my little tiny paintbrush, picked up a little tiny bit of paint, and I started building up these areas to give them the lines and to give them their lip color and to give them their eye color. And I did just a little bit at a time, and I had to be patient. And it takes a good, 10 or 20 minutes. If you touch the paper and it still feels damp, your color from here is going to bleed over to here, or your color from here is going to bleed over to here. So if you want to keep your colors crisp and not bleeding into each other, you have to let them dry. This was an area where this was wet, and this was wet, and this was wet, and this was wet, and they all blended together. I left her shirt dry so that they didn't blend into there. When that was the biggest problem that I had in understanding how watercolor worked when I was in high school. So there is my stuff. If you want to do a rainbow, rainbows work pretty well on here. It's a fun way to just kind of blend and do some pretty things. Okay, so there's my wet on wet. Now, we're going to leave this paper dry. I am going to get my paintbrush, and I'm going to pick up the same color. And so you see where I started is really dark. And as I run my paintbrush along, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. So wherever you start, that's going to be dark. Wherever you end, depending upon how far you push it, it's going to get light. You can use that technique to make your painting more interesting. So just keep that in mind. You can see that I was able to lay that down versus over here. If I tried to do the same thing, it gets real blendy and it starts to bleed out. So you can still do this, and this still looks interesting, but know why you're using it that way and why you're not. So here's my purple, and if I run my purple next to it, they're not going to blend together. And then I can pull this down a little bit Now, another thing that I forget to tell kids, you don't have to wash your paintbrush in between each color. You have to think about what you're going to do. So right now, I just used this kind of pink purple color. My paintbrush is wet. If I go into orange, I'm going to create a situation where maybe I'm picking up a little bit of this purple with this orange. And when I start to mix them, you have this weird color kind of come out of it. And we can actually blend watercolors right on our paper. You can also blend watercolors, on the plastic lid. The plastic lid has become its own little palette. So I could pick up a little bit of this. Now, if I jumped in here between my purple and my orange without knocking off some of my orange, or knocking off my purple, it's going to give me something different. So I mix those up a little bit, and then I can actually paint with that color versus my straight up orange. So I washed off my paintbrush, and I'm going to pick it up here. A lot of times I have kids that think that this is acrylic paint, and they think that because I have this, they're going to like really dig in here, and they're really going to pick up a lot of paint, and they're going to try to paint with that. Watercolor shouldn't be clumpy. Watercolor should be light. It should be translucent. And this pan of watercolors could last you for a couple of years if you take care of it. But if you're using it like acrylic and it's really, really, really thick like this, you're going to use a whole lot of it, a whole lot faster. And it's going to be hard to get your watercolor smooth. It's going to kind of end up clumpy. Now, if that is a technique that you want for some reason on your paper, you're welcome to try it. I don't mind. But try not to do that to your whole paper. Make sure that this is something you're intentionally doing and you're not doing because you're misunderstanding how to use the colors properly. So we're going to lay some of this in here just because I think it looks kind of pretty. And I'm going to pull a little bit more of this down here and see what happens. So we have this wet on dry, but it's going to turn on into a wet on wet because this down here is wet with the actual watercolor. So you start to see some of that blend. And that's kind of what happens along here too. Okay, so watercolor resist. If you use a pencil, something waxy, that matches the color of your actual paper. So let's say I was working on gray paper. I would want to use a gray coloring pencil. So in this case, I'm using white paper, so I want to use a white coloring pencil. And the idea is that maybe I am working on a piece that has little white areas. Maybe I am doing a portrait and I need the white shiny spot in somebody's eye. Or I need the white in their white parts of their eyes. So like the white footballs, for those of you who have listened and worked through my portrait demonstration. So this is my coloring pencil. And I'm laying a layer of wax down on my paper that matches the paper itself. And I'm going to go ahead and use my crayon here. I knew that was going to happen. Let me use my crayon and lay in just some designs back here. So I could have used this technique if I would have thought about it. Actually, I did use this technique. I used this technique on the whites of their eyes. I could have used it up here in this, or maybe on the door, like in the windows of the door. So if I would have thought about it more, I didn't think about it as much as I should. So I went ahead and laid this out. I'm going to go ahead and just for the sake of argument, just try my liquid watercolors. So that wax, the paint, ideally, is not going to stick to the wax. So what I'm doing here, I'm putting a little bit of water in here, and I'm picking up some of this little watercolor. I'm picking up this watercolor. So this is my UK blue instead of my cerulean blue. And I'm just going to paint this on. And I'm going to cover the whole thing. My coloring pencil did not work out. Well, don't you love it when techniques don't work out? Actually, it's good for you to see when something didn't work. I don't know. Let me look at my screen to see if you can see it. When I move this back and forth, you kind of see the shine, and you see where it's there. I'm going to let this area dry, and I might come back to it in a couple of minutes. Maybe I'm going to take a little bit more of my... Let's see how it dries. I see the flower coming up there. Well, I see them. So you see my little splash happening there. Actually, I see them popping out. We'll give them a minute. So your resist will create areas, and if you press really hard and you do a really good job, it'll work a little bit better. When I have kids in class, we usually use a white oil pastel because that's really when it pops a little bit better. I will tell you this too. When I taught elementary school, we would use oil pastels or crayons, and we would draw a picture, but we would leave the shapes open. And then we would go back in and we would paint into those particular shapes. So if you wanted to, you could use your coloring pencils to draw in a specific part of your actual piece if you want to. And then you could go back in and fill in areas with the watercolors. If you aren't finding if you're finding that you're struggling with it. Okay, so salt. Salt is one of my favorite things to use, just because it's just fun. So I'm going to put a lot of water down here. And this time I'm going to pick up some of this crimson. Maybe this watercolor is just old. Maybe that's why it's misbehaving. So salt has, yeah, I should have blended this up a lot more. By the way, that watercolor is probably, I think it's been sitting around my classroom for 2 years now. Somebody left it behind and didn't actually even use it. So I've gotten this really wet. Like, you should be able to see how wet it is. And when I drop the salt on it, the color sucks up to the salt. Now, this doesn't work all the time. And it doesn't work when your paper is dry. So that paint has to be very wet when you go to do that. But you see that it's kind of speckly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it dry totally. Now, I have two choices. I can go back when it's dry and I can knock that salt off. And I get all these little white polka dots left underneath it. And then if I leave it on there, then I have a really interesting texture. I kind of like the texture. I think it's kind of fun. Plastic wrap. So you saw just a minute ago when I removed that with tissue. Well, I'm going to do that again. Let's see. We're going to try this blue again because I really want it to kind of work. Kind of a fun color. It's not bad. And I'm going to do this with that. And then I'm going to do my purple down here so you can see the difference. So I'm just laying in my color. And then with the tissue, I'm just going to bunch it up. And I'm going to dab over here. Just a couple of little dabs. Now, this is a great way to remove color. Or it's kind of a great way to leave a texture. So if I wanted to really get most of that color up off of there, I could get it wet and I could dab it up. And when it dries, it'll dry a whole lot lighter. If you don't necessarily want to remove the color, but you want the texture, you use plastic wrap. And then you can even bring that little bit that's still left over there, and you can bring it down into there. So you get kind of a fun little texture. I would use this on trees. I would use this on like shrubs in the background. I don't know. I could use that in a lot of places. Okay, speckles. I am going to lay down some yellow because I have not done yellow yet. And I'm going to put it on there. Here, I'm using some of my water's blue. And so when I'm trying to use yellow with my blue water, it's turning it a little bit green. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is if you want straight up yellow. Make sure when you're using those lighter colors, you are always, always, always going back and getting clean, fresh water. So I'm knocking the majority of the water off of my paintbrush. I'm going to pick up some purple there. And I'm going to use my finger and I'm going to go speckles, 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 speckles. So that's a way that I can get that kind of rain happening there. I can also use my finger and then tap on my finger. If you're going to do this, make sure that you have some surface to cover this entire surface. Okay, so scratch. Whoa! I am going to scratch, let's say, I'm trying to get grass or hair. So I've scratched the paper. I'm not scratching through the paper, but I've left the texture. That's roughed up the fibers of the actual paper. And because it's roughed up the fibers of the paper, rather than dip it right back into the water, or dip it right back into the green paint, I just picked up a little bit of water because I want this to be real kind of light. And you can kind of see where I scratched, you get those darker greens. And then where I didn't scratch, you get those lighter colors. And then if I wanted to kind of start to add dimension to this, I could pick up another color and put it in here. And that's not going to stick to the darker. And that's going to give me, you know, my grass that's multi-dimensional, multicolored. So there's that. Now with the speckle, you see that I have a little bit of a problem. Where my paper was dry, I have my speckles, and where my paper was wet, I now have kind of these bursts. So that's something for you to be very aware of. And then the final one is plastic print. So I have a piece of plastic that is the size of my paper here. It's picked up a little bit of red paint up here. But let's say I wanted something that looked a little bit impressionistic. The Impressionists were worried about creating a sense of light and a sense of movement. They wanted their paintings to be fast and not heavily detailed. They just wanted things like laid in, just fast and beautiful and all that. So I'm going to lay in a bunch of this. And just for the sake of argument, because I'm really kind of enjoying this purple. Crayola, I'm proud of you. Never before have I been really, really happy with you, but this palette's not bad. So I just laid in some paint on here. I'm going to flip it over. And I'm going to lay it down here. And I got my little blobs of flowers, and then I'm going to lay in my blobs of green. And that's just going to kind of give me maybe something that looks way far off in the distance, just a field of blobby flowers. This one also kind of works like if you still had that paint that I had on here, that I was dabbing here, and just turned it around and dabbed it down here, that brings that down there. Let's say I have this big puddle here. If I remove that big puddle, I now have my paper color below here. So you can always, that's the cool thing that I've learned about watercolor is that you can always remove. That's the area earlier that I really clumped my paint on there. It dries kind of weird and shiny. It doesn't really dry really kind of pretty. And back over here, you can see where the paint kind of left a ghost image. So my resist left a ghost image. So it just depends on how heavily you lay that down. On this one, this was a white oil pastel, and so you see a much more defined line there than you do here with the coloring pencil were these little flower starbursts, and the crayon was these around here. The crayon probably worked better than the coloring pencil did. So this right here is your final image. I will take a picture of this. And I hope you all have a fantastic day. Good luck. Have some fun with this. And then this week, as you work, go ahead and start coming up with ideas for how your parody is going to look. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I will get back with you as soon as I can. If nothing's going on in class or not much is going on in class during class, I will turn on a Google Meet. So if you're at home, you might be able to pop in and ask. If my planning is at 1:30, so if you send me a question, I will be answering you after 1:30, but I will get back to you. Have a great day.